Thank you, Jerry. I'm delighted to be back here with so many good friends from many years back, and really genuinely delighted to speak to you. And I'm really particularly delighted to speak to you about a topic that I suspect many of you have never heard anything about, and that is Robert Creuzbaur, the Captain Nemo of Texas. So what this story that I'm about to tell you is just one of the stories that's coming out in a book that I have coming out later this year. And the book is being published by State House Press, and the title of it is Rockets, Tanks, and Submarines, The Ingenuity of Civil War Texans. And it covers a lot of the strange things that you would not associate with the Civil War that were being invented and worked on, sometimes successfully, sometimes completely unsuccessfully, during the Civil War. And one of the stories in that involves Robert Creuzbaur and this amazing Civil War warship that he designed. And so with that, let me start off. Now, you folks, I can look out and see that many of you are my generation. And one of the movies that I remember very, very fondly when I was young was Walt Disney's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And you'll remember Captain Nemo, who's shown here on the screen from that movie. And just to refresh your memory about the story, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea was published by Jules Verne in 1871, so only about 6 years after the end of the Civil War. And its plot revolves around a guy named Professor Aronnax. And Aronnax signs on to an expedition that's going to go out and search the world and try to find a sea monster, or what they think is a sea monster, that is terrorizing shipping around the world. So he signs on to this expedition. They find the sea monster and discover that, in fact, it's not a sea monster. It is this incredibly technologically sophisticated submarine, the Nautilus, and its eccentric commander, Captain Nemo. And so that's the story in 20,000 Leagues. And the story was so popular that Jules Verne actually kept the same character and brought him over to the next book in the series, which was The Mysterious Island, about 5 years later. It's the only character that Verne carried over like that because it was so popular. And so that story is something that has stuck with me, and I'm sure with many of you, for many years. What you may not know is that a lot of the stuff in Jules Verne's book was directly tied to the American Civil War. He was absolutely fascinated with our conflict. He wrote 2 books that are explicitly about the Civil War, The Blockade Runners in 1871 and North Against South in 1887. And again, Captain Nemo makes his appearance again in Mysterious Island in 1875. And that book, if you'll remember, starts with 5 men escaping, they're Union men, escaping from a Richmond, Virginia Confederate prison in a balloon, and they then end up at the Mysterious Island. And when they land on the Mysterious Island, they name their new camp after Abraham Lincoln. So Verne is definitely fascinated with the Civil War. And he was particularly fascinated, we know, with the Confederate commerce raider Alabama. And that may strike you as surprising too. But beginning in 1998, 2 Jules Verne scholars pointed out that there are eerie similarities between the Nautilus, as it's depicted in the book, and CSS Alabama. Both Nautilus and Alabama were constructed at the Laird Shipyard at Birkenhead near Liverpool. Of course, the Nautilus is fictional, but Verne says that the hull plates for Nautilus were constructed at Birkenhead at Liverpool. And each vessel the hull was done there, but then it was completed on a desert island, the Azores in the case of the Alabama. Each vessel then went around the world terrorizing shipping, with both ending up the book in a climactic battle in the English Channel. And what's funny is somebody went to the CSS Alabama and they figured out the mileage everywhere the Alabama went during the period that was operating during the war. And if you add it up and convert it to leagues, it is just over 21,000 leagues. Eerie similarities, which makes you think that, in fact, Verne was fascinated with this. And in fact, we know he was really interested in it. In 1859, Jules Verne took his first trip overseas, anywhere or abroad from France. Where did he go for vacation? Liverpool. and he visited Birkenhead, the shipyard there, and he returned again in 1867, just before the book came out, 20,000 Leagues. Now, I say that Verne was fascinated with the Alabama. Don't get me wrong, Verne was not a Confederate sympathizer. In fact, on Captain Nemo's wall on the Nautilus, Captain Nemo has two pictures. One was Abraham Lincoln, and the other was Frederick Douglass. So he kind of took the Alabama and turned it on its head and used it to help with the plot of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. But that brings me to Robert Creuzbaur, who I've called the Captain Nemo of Texas. And you'll see why I call him that here in a minute. We'll start at the beginning. He's born in 1823 in Karlsruhe, Germany. Now, that's near the French border. It's in Germany, but just barely. And Karlsruhe was kind of like the Silicon Valley of France and Germany at the time. That was where all the real technological types were going, and that was where all the educational facilities were. So Creuzbaur had a really good scientific expedition or scientific education growing up. Now, his parents were very interesting. His father, Carl Friedrich Creuzbaur, had been an artillery officer under Napoleon and had actually participated in Napoleon's terribly tragic campaign going over into Russia. His mother, Baroness Caroline von Ornig of Austria, had been royalty. Her family had been royalty for many years, but they'd kind of been demoted after the War of the Austrian Succession. So his parents had lots of great stories, but they had very little money. And they decided to immigrate to the United States, and it's kind of odd. This happens about 1842, and they end up settling in St. Louis, Missouri, of all places. And there, Robert will finish his education. He finishes as an engineer and gets a good education in St. Louis. And he says, you know, I don't really want to live in Missouri. I want to live somewhere else. And the place he picked to move to was Austin, Texas. So he comes down here when he's about 19 years old. And he does two things when he reaches the Texas line. The first is he changes the spelling of his name. Originally, it had been Creuzbauer, and he omitted that second E, which is something that a lot of the Germans did. And his brother did the same thing, so it's now Baur. So he changed the spelling of his name. The second thing was he decided to take a job with the General Land Office as a cartographer and use his engineering and drafting skills as a cartographer. And he's starting there in about 1846. So this is really during the formative years of Texas. And he hits Texas and he hits the GLO and he does a great job. And within a matter of a couple of years, he is a superstar of map making. And Rob Jones and I went over there today and saw some of the original Creuzbaur maps, and you'll see pictures of some of them here in a minute. But this guy could make maps that you just wouldn't believe were done by hand. And the little tiny things and the details are just absolutely amazing. The most famous thing he did is he prepared a map of Texas for Jacob de Cordova in 1849 that is famous because it's the first official map of the state of Texas. Sam Houston, who was a senator at the time, signed the de Cordova map and called it invaluable. And then Creuzbaur followed that up a couple of years later with a map that showed a route from Texas all the way to California with details of where the water stops were, what the geology was like, and places to camp. It became essential reading for everybody that was a 49er heading out to California. His 1853 map of Austin was one of the best early maps of the city. And then in 1857, Creuzbaur took on a real adventure. He decided that he would take on an operation to go out and survey a bunch of lands out in the frontier areas that were being dedicated for the various asylums, the deaf and blind asylums, the orphans asylum, all these different things. And they had lands that were assigned and ultimately sold for the benefit of these charitable institutions. But before they could be sold, you had to figure out exactly where they were and what they looked like. And so Creuzbaur went out there with a couple of guys. They actually surveyed it. It must have been wild, dodging the Indians and doing everything he did out in the frontier regions. He came back and produced some incredibly detailed maps They're the best early maps we have of these parts of Texas. And so today, if you go to the GLO website and start putting in the name Creuzbaur, page after page after page of maps come out there. And so when I say that Robert Creuzbaur's name is stamped on the early history of Texas, I don't mean, that's hypothetically. He is literally on there. And you can see right here, this is his name right here, and then it's signed in very, very elaborate writing. And everything he did was almost like calligraphy the way he wrote, because he was such a talented map maker. But he wanted to be more than a map maker. He was determined to show that he was more than just a graphic artist, that he could actually invent things. And so he started working on drawings of things that he thought would be useful inventions. And in 1861, at the age of 38, Creuzbaur obtained his first United States patent for an air chamber. And here you see the drawing that he did right there on the side with his elaborate signature at the bottom right. It's an air chamber, something you could pump air into, and it would hold air in a pressurized state. Now, this patent, his first patent, came out in June of 1861. Think about the timing there. By the time his patent was finally granted, Texas had seceded, and so Creuzbaur now had a U.S. patent, but he didn't think he lived in the United States anymore. So this was an interesting challenge, but that was his first patent. Creuzbaur was a reluctant rebel. He wasn't a big supporter of slavery, but he didn't like the idea of secession, and that was common to a lot of these German immigrants. But when it first became a reality, Creuzbaur gave it his full support and started trying to figure out ways that he could help his new adopted state. And as Creuzbaur saw it, again, he was very familiar with the Texas coastline. He had done maps of all of that area, and he knew how hard it would be to defend that vast 400-mile coastline, particularly since he knew there were no big forts like there were at Fort Sumter or the forts below New Orleans or at Mobile. We didn't have anything like that. We didn't have any warships. How in the world are you going to defend all these coastal settlements, which most of Texas was at the time, when you didn't have any forts and you didn't have any warships? You were going to have to get really, really creative. And if anybody ever was creative, it was Robert Creuzbaur. Creuzbaur's answer was that he was going to invent a ship, one ship, that would completely decimate the United States Navy. And the ship that he invented was called the Sea King. And on November the 11th of 1861, Creuzbaur submitted what he called a memorial to Texas Governor Francis R. Lubbock. And I've actually included here a picture of what he sent to Lubbock. And you can see again his lovely signature with all the elaborate things underneath it. And what Creuzbaur told Lubbock was that he had invented a cheap and most effective substitute for a war navy. It was a substitute for a navy to be placed at the service of the Confederate government. And he said, you ought to adopt this as soon as you can, because the sooner you adopt it, the sooner you're going to end this war. Well, Lubbock heard that and said, this really sounds good. We need to get some people to look at this fast. So what was this miracle warship that Creuzbaur had invented? Well, I'll show you a lot more of it later, but just to give you some idea of what it was a cylindrical, kind of a cigar-shaped thing, like this British thing that had been designed by the Winans. And it would have both a bow propeller and a stern propeller. So you had one at each end. And its hull would consist of angled wood and cotton structures supporting an outer layer of iron plates. It had three different modes of weapon systems, and Creuzbaur was kind of cagey about what he said Lubbock and said, I can't tell you about the third one because it's so secret. We just got to keep this a secret for now. And Lubbock said, oh, this really sounds good now, and gave it over to the engineers. The engineers looked at the designs, and they all loved it. All three of them just fell in love with the design. And they came back in 10 days. Imagine that, a committee that you form, and they come back and do a whole study and come back with a report in 10 days. That's amazing progress. And they came back and they unanimously endorsed the Sea King. And engineer James Brown, who was the most famous of the groups of the engineers in the group, said that Sea King, he thought, had the potential to destroy in a short time the whole naval power of our enemies. And so to do that, the legislature quickly passed a bill appropriating $500 for Creuzbaur and his lawyer to travel to Richmond and present his plans to the new Confederate government. So the Sea King had gotten a very, very strong endorsement from Texas. And so Creuzbaur and his attorney go to Richmond, and when they present their credentials and their plans, they are sent over to the new Confederate Navy Department. And in charge of testing these new plans at the Navy Department was a very famous guy named Matthew Fontaine Maury. And Maury said, well, you have some interesting ideas here. Let's go test some of them. And one of the things that was unique about the Sea King was that it had a cannon on it, but it was an underwater cannon. This was a cannon that would fire underwater and send a shell over underwater into an enemy warship. Nobody had ever done anything like that. And so Maury said, build a scale model of your underwater cannon and let's test it. And so Creuzbaur built his scale model. They bought a bunch of wooden forms and simulated the hulls of enemy warships. And they took these big frames out on a barge, and every day they'd go out on the Confederate steamer teaser, which is shown here, with the little underwater cannon, and they would test fire at various distances and angles against these wooden frames to see how far Creuzbaur's cannon penetrated the hulls on these simulated hulls. And darn it, the thing worked. Maury's report concluded that at a distance of several feet, the effect of the submarine shot was such as to penetrate through the timbers of ordinary ships of war. So if you could do this at several feet, again, you don't have long range here, but you could definitely do some damage with an underwater cannon. So this was a strong endorsement of the Sea King. Now, I say everybody liked the Sea King, and everybody that saw it loved it. And so Creuzbaur and his attorney, a guy named Ebenezer Allen, got really excited about the whole idea. And they were dreaming there were going to be a whole fleet of these things. They were going to get rich on the basis of it. So Creuzbaur decided that he would make some lovely color drawings of the Sea King. And they changed the name of it. They said, Sea King is not good enough. We need to really sell this thing. And so they changed the name to the Avenger. Now, these drawings, these colored drawings, have survived, and I'm really lucky the family's allowed me to show you and publish these drawings of the Avenger and the remarkable things that it did. And so I'm going to take you basically on a tour of the Avenger as it would have looked if it had been constructed. And these drawings are done in July of 1862. So this is the side view of the front. And again, this is the front of the vessel, and you'll see this weird thing here. A bow propeller, which no other warship in the Civil War had. And in fact, something like this, a horizontal bow propeller, was not even patented US-wise until the 1980s. This thing was way, way ahead of its time. And the idea was, Creuzbaur had gotten the idea that, you know, if I'm going to have to get close to a ship to fire this underwater cannon, I got to be able to maneuver really, really well. And particularly if I'm having an ironclad, I want to be able to control the angle at which I approach an enemy vessel very, very specifically. And so we decided to have this horizontal propeller. And he said, you know, people are not going to really understand how this bow propeller moved because there weren't anything else out there like it. So he then drew some individual drawings showing the pistons on either side of the propeller looking down from the top, and then a side view showing how the mechanics of it would work on the inside of the hull. So again, this is revolutionary. Now, we're going to now start with the center and top of the vessel. The bottom one is just kind of showing you from looking at it straight down on top of the casemate, and you can see he was real clever and actually put the name of the ship there, the Avenger, so you can see what it looks like. And then up top, we just only have part of this one. It was kind of damaged, unfortunately. But this shows you the stern of the vessel with a propeller at the back and two rudders. And then there's this casemate on top of it. It's an iron casemate. And we're going to look at the details of it because it is an absolutely fascinating thing. This is the front part of it. And you can see that there's a guy on top who has a pilot house. It's kind of a curved structure on top. And this is the guy who's piloting the ship from up there. And then underneath, there is a gun, and you can see that that is inside the hull of the vessel, and it has an iron flap on the outside. It is a breech loading gun that can be fired, and you just put it out, you load it, put it out the front of it, and then fire the gun, and then it retacks and recoils back into the ship. Now, again, it's only going to fire, this is the only gun above the surface of the vessel, and it's only going to fire straight ahead. Normally, that's a problem. You wouldn't be able to point it where you want it to go. But think about the bow propeller. Once you have the bow propeller, you can figure exactly where you want it to be and then fire your gun. So now we go to the back, and here's where it really gets interesting. You see that guy standing back there in the back, and he's operating a very strange apparatus. What that is a whole collection of levers and mirrors. And what he's looking through is a periscope. Now, periscopes had been invented shortly before the Civil War, but they had never been used in combat before. And they wouldn't be used in combat until 1864. So again, this is amazing that it's being used here in Creuzbaur's drawings. He has a periscope there. And the guy has a funny thing that he's standing in front of that's going down through the bottom of the hull. And that is called the submarine battery tube. And this is something that no other warship had, and I don't think anybody in the war ever even thought about doing something like this. So how is this going to operate? So I'm going to show you, again, there are three modes of attack. There's the gun that's firing on top of the vessel, which we've seen, the one that fires straight ahead. Then there's this underwater cannon. And again, this is a cannon that just is pointing out the side of the hull that fires a shell a short distance and penetrates the Federal ship. And here you can see it firing right there with a puff of smoke underwater and the shell coming over and penetrating the Federal hull. And what he says is it doesn't have to penetrate very far because these are going to be exploding shells, and that they will then explode and damage the Federal vessel. So that's the underwater cannon in operation. Now, the submarine battery tube is harder to explain, but it's a very interesting weapon. His idea there was that you were going to drop something down through the submarine tube. It's not clear whether it was going to be pushed out or fired out or how it was going to come out, but it would consist of two things that were tied together with a line. And one of the things on the bottom would be an exploding shell that was hooked up basically like a mine, a torpedo. And then it was tied to a float that would go to the surface. And the idea was that you'd send this out through the submarine battery tube right to where the Federal ship was. The float would come up and would pull the torpedo up against the bottom of the Federal hull, at which point it would hit the hull and explode on the very bottom of the Federal hull. And this was a very clever idea. And then he said, all right, I'm going to show you how you would deploy this. And this is the neat one. This is from above. And the top one is the Confederate ship, that's the Avenger, and the bottom one is probably a Federal ironclad down there at the bottom. And you can see that he sent out the two little things that are tied together through that submarine battery tube out the bottom, because he's going ahead just like the Federal ship is, but he's ahead of it. And he sent it out, it's coming back to the bottom. This is on the bottom of the hull, the torpedo coming up the hull, and that's the float that's pulling it up against the bottom of the Federal ship. So those are the three ways the Avenger was intended to work. Now he knew people are going to say, okay, well that's all real interesting, but how is this thing going to actually operate? What's the inside of it going to look like? And here is where we get some really, really interesting details. So this is looking straight down the cross section of the Avenger. And I'm going to start over here at the right. We're going to make a tour of what the hull looks like. As you can see, it's sort of almost triangular with the way it's going to operate. The water level over there, it says, if you could read the small print, it says it's 8 feet, but during battle, it might be as much as 9 feet. And that means that it's able to take on ballast and actually sink a little bit so that less of it is above the water for the enemy to hit. So that's a clever thing. The ship is 3 inches of iron, which is basically what the Virginia was, same depth of iron, and it's covering 15 inches of cotton and then 12 more inches of wood. So the idea is that you have this iron hull, but it's floating on something like cotton. It's going to absorb some of the impact. So even if it hits, even if a shell hits it, it'll kind of bounce off and absorb it, and the damage won't be severe. Then at the top you have the 2 exits for the air and the exhaust, and you see the smoke tube here. This is the submarine battery tube that we talked about, where you're sending out the 2 little things connected with the float. And he also put on there, just as funny, he's thinking of everything. He says this also doubles as the privy pipe as well. And so you have, then on the side you have coal bunkers and water tanks. This is the underwater cannon on this side. You can see how it operates with a piston that comes back to absorb the recoil. It has 2 boilers that are 6 feet in diameter and 22 feet long, 1 at each end. So he's thought about this a lot and has a lot of details on it. Everybody is impressed with these drawings except the Navy that has to build this ship. And they look at it and they say, golly, these are all these wild things. We don't know how we would do any of these things. The combination, this is impossible. No, thank you, but no. And Confederate Secretary of the Navy, Stephen Mallory, says it's just too complicated. Creuzbaur and his attorney have gone too far to give up. So they go and lobby the Confederate Congress, and Congress looks at these drawings and they says, oh yeah, we need one of these. We've got to have one of these. And so they pass legislation authorizing the building of the Avenger. So Mallory goes to Jefferson Davis and says, they've circumvented me here. This is a bad idea. And so Jefferson Davis angrily vetoes the legislation. And so for the time being, Avenger is dead. But again, Creuzbaur and his attorney have gone too far to give up now. So where do you go for somebody that's just crazy enough they might actually authorize building the Avenger and really need something to deal with an enemy blockade? Charleston, South Carolina. So they go to South Carolina, and on the way to South Carolina, Creuzbaur and Ebenezer Allen, his lawyer, are thinking about how can we make this even more sellable. And so Creuzbaur actually refined his design by this point. Yeah, Avenger's now about 180 feet long and 40 feet wide at its widest. And they show it to Governor Francis W. Pickens, who's the fairly unattractive guy, frankly, that's shown there on the right. And Governor Pickens looks at it, and just like everybody else that's not having to build the thing, they love it. And he recommends the legislature support building one of Creuzbaur's shot-proof vessels of war. And so, everything's going well. And South Carolina actually agrees that they will buy the Avenger for $350,000, which is a lot of money. But the purchase contract that they authorize may be one of the worst maritime construction contracts in history. In order to get paid, Creuzbaur and his men will have to build the Avenger somewhere else, because you couldn't possibly build this thing in the Confederacy at the time. The curved iron components, all the other stuff, it's just impossible. They have to scramble to build the Virginia, which is a much simpler vessel than this. So to get paid for the Avenger, it would have to be built somewhere else, probably in Europe, probably in England. And then it would have to get across the ocean. Then it would have to fight its way through the blockade into Charleston Harbor and pull up to the dock at Charleston Harbor. At that point, the governor of South Carolina would then appoint an engineer, and the engineer would then come out and inspect it. And if he said it was good, then they would get the $350,000. But the South Carolina reserved the right to pay that purchase price either in cotton priced at 16 cents per pound, or South Carolina bonds with a 6% interest coupon. So think about that. You're the financial backer that have come along behind Creuzbaur. You've built this thing. You've sailed it across the ocean. You fought your way through the blockade. Somehow you get in. Somehow you pull up to the wharf. Somehow you make it through the governor's hand-picked inspector. You do all that, and what do you end up with? You might end up with 2 million pounds of cotton in a blockaded port, or a bunch of bonds issued by a state that is then in the process of rebellion. Doesn't sound very attractive, does it? And in fact, I don't think there was ever any idea that they could sell this idea to anybody else. But they valiantly tried. They set up a partnership called Allen and Sprague, and of course that wasn't fooling anybody. Allen was his lawyer, and Sprague was a guy, was just some guy that they had, was a friend in Galveston. And so this partnership was going to try to raise the money to build Avenger. And they tried all sorts of unconventional sources. My favorite of these unconventional sources is that they wrote to the Ladies Gunboat Society of Mississippi. Now, you may be familiar with this organization, but what they did, these ladies would go around and hold raffles and bazaars and all kinds of benefits, and they would raise money and give it to the Confederacy to build gunboats. That's what they did. And so Allen contacted them and said, look, we've got this thing. We're going to eventually build maybe 6 of these things, and if you help us, we'll assign one of these gunboats to protect the good state of Mississippi and its waterways. This will be great. The only problem was he addressed his solicitation to the Ladies Gunboat Society of Mississippi to Dear Sir. As far as I could determine, they never even got an answer to this communication. And if anybody volunteered to put up $1 to build the Avenger, I have never been able to find any evidence that that was the case. So, but again, I don't think they ever really thought anybody would do that, would build it under the terms presented by South Carolina. The lawyer wrote to some friendly congressional representatives in Richmond, and he said, we hope the example of South Carolina will have an effect to neutralize the hostility of Secretary Mallory and also to encourage Congress to authorize the construction of enough of these vessels to retake the Mississippi River and inflict punishment in other quarters upon the enemy. All these efforts failed. Avenger would never be built. Avenger would never avenge anything. Now, at this point, Creuzbaur is just kind of twiddling his thumbs in Richmond, Virginia. He's trying to hope that something will happen and Avenger will spring back into life, but he's looking for work. And so he receives a contract from the Confederate Navy to go out there and provide materials and construct a floating battery, which is primarily a bunch of mines and torpedoes that he has designed. He's also started inventing again. And so on May 6th of 1863, he receives a Confederate patent for a wooden sole shoe, which is a big thing. And then he says, I'm not doing anything good here in Virginia. Nobody knows me. This thing's a disaster. I need to go back where the people actually know me and like me. I need to go back to Texas. So he has an influential person there in Virginia write a friend of his, General John Bankhead Magruder in Texas, and recommend that Magruder take on Creuzbaur onto his engineering staff. And so Magruder reads this strong endorsement and immediately offers Creuzbaur a position on July the 3rd of 1863. And so Creuzbaur begins making travel plans to come back to Texas. Now, while he's waiting and getting everything in order before he can come back to Texas, Creuzbaur hears about something that's going on up in Tennessee. And what has happened is, and this is another story in my book, there's a group of men in Port Lavaca, Texas, who have revolutionized warfare by designing a floating mine torpedo that is just the best one that has been invented yet. They will sink more Union warships than the Confederate Navy and the Confederate Army combined. This little group of men from Port Lavaca, Texas. And at one point here in the war, they say, we could probably adapt some of these floating mines to use on land. And what they come up with is they plant some of these mines under the railroad tracks during the night with a rod sticking up from the mine up above the tracks. And what happens is when the train goes over it, the axle of the train triggers this rod, which then hits the explosives beneath and blows up the railroad train. This is a pretty good thing. And they actually, they will claim later that they blow up 8 separate trains in Tennessee using these mines. But the problem is this. You have no control over which train or what part of the train you're going to blow up. Whatever train comes along, the first car is going to trigger that explosive and it's going to blow up. It might be a civilian train, it might be a military train, you don't know. And the Union railroad conductors get very leery of what's going on, and they start pushing along what they call devils, which is just a flat railroad car ahead of them with some wires on it, so that whatever triggers this explosion will blow up that car and not the railroad engine. And so Creuzbaur says, we need to make these weapons smarter. And so what he does is he submits a drawing, and you can see it right here, with the explosive down below, and then the rod comes up over the side, but it has a pin and a long wire on it, a long lanyard. And his idea is that you have a guy who has this rope in hand about 50 yards away behind a tree, and he watches what's coming down the railroad line. And if it's a civilian train, he doesn't pull the line. If it's a military train, he lets the first car go over. He tries to figure out what is the ideal place to blow up that's going to do the most damage to the most military targets. If it's men, if it's ordnance, whatever it is, you can actually time it to do the most damage to the part that you want to do it. And he sends this over to the Confederacy kind of as a last parting gift as he's leaving town. As he's leaving town, he has a really good month in August of 1863 because the Confederacy finally gets around to setting up special designated Secret Service groups. And Creuzbaur becomes one of 7 men that are assigned to the Trans-Mississippi Department. That's the area west of the Mississippi. And they are set on the special service of destroying the enemy's property by torpedoes and similar inventions. So the men, in addition to their regular pay, they even give them a very powerful incentive and say that you will get 50% of the property destroyed by your new inventions and all the arms and munitions captured by them. So you're going to get a 50%. If you sink a warship, you're going to get 50% of the value of that warship. That's a powerful incentive for these guys. So these guys now have a mission, they now have a powerful incentive, and they're all real interested in getting to work. And then late in August, as he's on his way to Texas, Creuzbaur receives 2 more Confederate patents for wooden sole shoes and a patent for his torpedo mine. Now, these are wooden sole shoes from the Civil War. I don't know if these are Creuzbaur patent wooden sole shoes, but this is something the Confederacy found very, very useful because getting serviceable leather for the bottom of those shoes when men are marching a lot was very hard to do, and these wooden sole shoes, I can't think they'd be very pleasant to walk on, but apparently they were serviceable for the job. All right, so Creuzbaur is now back in Texas. It's September the 21st of 1863. Creuzbaur reaches Texas and reports to General Magruder. Now, his title was Assistant Civil Engineer, and he's getting the pay of a captain. But that's all just kind of a sham. And the idea is you have to make these Secret Service guys a formal part of the Confederate military. Because if they're out doing these things and firing torpedoes and setting mines and that sort of thing, and they're captured, they need to be able to credibly claim that they are on, formal military service instead of being, hung as spies. So that's the whole idea behind that. No, he says he's an assistant civil engineer. On the actual invoices in the Confederate records, it says that Creuzbaur is actually designated as constructing torpedoes and other infernal machines. And I love the idea that even the Confederacy considers what these guys are building infernal machines. So think about the timing here. It's now November the 1st of 1863. Battle of Sabine Pass has happened. Thank goodness, you've kept the Yankees out of East Texas. But by this point, the Yankees have decided we're going to come up the coast of Texas. We're going to land on the Rio Grande and then march up the entire coast of Texas. And so a huge invasion force is plotting its way up along the various barrier island beaches on their way, eventually to reach Galveston. And Magruder is just pulling out his hair, trying to figure out how he's going to stop all these guys. It seems like an invincible force. Creuzbaur has his own answer, and he says, I got it, we'll create a torpedo cannon. Now, the torpedo cannon was going to be torpedoes, these are mines, that are spaced with their firing ends facing the enemy, and they're spaced at 10-yard intervals on an embankment, or if there's not an embankment, a breastwork. And think about the beaches of South Texas. You're not going to have any embankments there of any consequence. You're going to have to build up something, and then these things are going to be spaced up about 3 or 4 feet above the tops of these things, facing out at the enemy at 10-yard intervals. And he'd actually calculated that each finished torpedo would weigh about 118 pounds, which meant that a wagon capable of carrying 3,000 pounds could carry about 24 of these fully charged torpedoes. And he thought that would be enough. Just one wagon, you could install these things facing out at the enemy about 1/8 of a mile long. And you weren't talking about a lot of labor to fire them. He said, if you want, we can even rig these things to where they could be fired by somebody hitting a tripwire or just stepping on something. You wouldn't even have to have a single person out there. And he said, these things are ideal. And so he wrote in, and you can see in his language there on the side, will the general desire any of these for immediate purposes? And he underlines that in big letters. Well, Magruder's very busy, and he doesn't know Creuzbaur very well at this point. He likes the idea, but he tries to send it up to the Confederate engineering department up in Shreveport to see what they think of it. They kind of like it, but they really don't like the idea that Creuzbaur had to try and put them on boats or something like that. So they kind of give a lukewarm response. And fortunately, the Union eventually will give up on their march up the Texas coast, and then they'll go over to Louisiana and embark on the Red River Campaign. But that's not the end of Creuzbaur's service. He's still on this mission to try and sink some enemy ships, and he's focused on Galveston, where all these things are happening at this point. So in July of 1864, Creuzbaur begins a secret project. Now, again, there's hardly any records of this stuff. I am piecing this stuff together through little tiny mentions and special orders and things like that. It is very hard to figure out what exactly is going on here. But on July the 9th of 1864, Magruder issued an order instructing his engineers to offer all necessary aid and labor to Creuzbaur for constructing his torpedoes and shields for the protections of the crews. So these are obviously small boats with torpedoes in front, and then iron shields of some sort to protect them against the enemy vessels. Creuzbaur requisitions 40 sheets of flat iron to construct torpedoes and arms to be used from boats at night in case of meeting with hostile boats while operating with torpedoes. So he's obviously preparing a swarm of boats with torpedoes to go out and attack the enemy blockaders. So what did Creuzbaur intend to do with these torpedoes? We don't know exactly how they were to be deployed. It may be just some version of the torpedo cannon that he had originally suggested using on land in 1863. It could be that he was trying to still figure out some way to float them under the enemy vessels as he proposed with inventors, or it may be that he was planning to deploy them on the end of a spar torpedo, because that's happened with the submarine Hunley, and it's also what the Union used to attack the Confederate ironclad Albemarle in October of 1864. But this is obviously underway as the end of 1864 approaches. It then heats up in March of 1865. And again, Creuzbaur's mysterious secret small boat project heats up. Special orders are issued in March 1865 authorizing Creuzbaur to obtain tools and materials at Columbus, and directed that a bunch of launches be purchased or impressed for the project. And in April, Magruder authorized Creuzbaur to obtain a cutter for use in his special project. Was the project ever completed? And the answer is, as far as I know, it never was. Because the next thing we hear from Robert Creuzbaur is that he signs a parole in July the 26th of 1865 in Travis County, and he just signs it, and very simply, as a captain of the engineering service, without any mention that he was actually, constructing infernal machines, as you might expect. That did not appear to have come up to him. So that's the end of Creuzbaur's Civil War career, but that wasn't the end of his career for a long time, because Creuzbaur did something very interesting. Most Confederate officers, as you know, if they left the Confederate States, went south. They went to Mexico, they went to Brazil, they went to Honduras, they went to places south where they could escape Union retribution. Not Creuzbaur. He was always kind of contradictory to what was expected. He headed north to Brooklyn, New York, where he put out his shingle as a civil engineer and quickly became famous for designing many important civil projects. And you can see his drawings are big in all of the New York engineering records in the post-war career. He was by far the most successful Confederate inventor after the war. And by my count, he secured at least 29 United States patents. And although none related to experimental warships, several related to steam engines and boats. But the thing was, as he grew older, Creuzbaur became more and more eccentric. And he completely alienated his family because he would write scathing letters to the newspapers and famous figures at the drop of a hat. So if the New York Times said something he didn't like, he wrote a vicious letter to the New York Times. It was published a few days later, and his family was, oh God, this is awful, and he was dealing with all these things in a very insulting manner. He did not have a gentle manner of dealing with his people. In 1891, he wrote a letter to Thomas Edison demanding that Edison invest in his syndicate to build a non-exhaust motor. Edison didn't respond, as far as I know. In 1899, he wrote to former President Theodore Roosevelt, demanding that the former president use his influence to force the United States Navy to use Creuzbaur's pneumatic static ship propulsion system, which he had named the PSSPS and thought was a great deal for the U.S. Navy. Roosevelt politely declined. And Creuzbaur, as he got older and more eccentric, he started doing weird things. And one of the things he did was that he became convinced that he was a great dowser for water. And he got copper wires, and he would go around trying to locate water underground. Now, I have always been very skeptical of these claims. But the funny thing is, I found all kinds of later things in the newspapers by people who'd been skeptical like me that had him out there, and he had actually located water wells where nobody had a right to expect water would be. So maybe there was something to it that I don't know. But by now, Creuzbaur is getting older. It's after 1900, and Creuzbaur lived to see automobiles invented. And he had all kinds of ideas for how automobiles could be improved. And he wrote all kinds of letters to automobile magazines about how to improve automobiles. And then even before the Wright brothers had invented powered flight, Creuzbaur turned his attention to that. And he was convinced that the only way to design an airplane was to make one that flew exactly as the birds flew. So he spent several years studying the way birds flew. And he finally designed his own airplane, which he called the Volant, V-O-L-A-N-T. It was unlike any previous airplane, as you might imagine. Volant was shaped like a parachute with a triangular sail, and naturally, Creuzbaur developed his own revolutionary propeller, and naturally used the same non-exhaust motor that he unsuccessfully pitched to Thomas Edison. So in a 1909 article in a Brooklyn newspaper, Creuzbaur said that he was so confident in his design of the Volant that if he could just get some capitalist to build it, he would compete in it in an air show competition, even though he was 84 years old. Nobody took him up on the offer. Now, I'd always wondered what the Volant looked like, and I said, well, I guess that's just a secret that died with Robert Creuzbaur. 2 weeks ago, I'm surfing the internet, and I happened to see a mention that Creuzbaur had some correspondence with the Smithsonian Institution. So I dropped a line to him. I said, can you just let me know what this is? And about 2 days later, I got a list of the things that they had and a copy of the materials. And sure enough, Creuzbaur had sent his blueprints for his airplane to the Smithsonian Institution. And so here is just one of them, just to give you an idea of what he sent the Smithsonian, of what it was going to operate like. It kind of looks like a diamond, and this you're looking at the propeller on the front of it there. That was going to be. But this was his airplane. Unfortunately, Creuzbaur did not live to see it done. He died in 1911 at his home in Brooklyn. He was 88 years old. On September 13, 1912, almost a year after his death, Robert Creuzbaur's patent for a motor was finally granted. That motor had taken a record 24 years to process the patent application after its date of application. It's a record. And when a reporter researched the issue, Creuzbaur's family told him on the QT that they had actually delayed the patent process so they could eventually handle this promising invention without Creuzbaur's obstruction or interference. They were waiting for the old man to die, and then they were going to try to market the invention. Just to give you an idea of the scale of Robert Creuzbaur's inventing career, his first patent that I showed you in 1861 was number 32,952. His last patent in 1912 was number 1,037,842. So during his inventing career, over 1 million things were invented. So this guy started off as a map maker from Germany in the dodging Indians to make some of the great maps of Texas. He became a Secret Service agent in the Civil War, and then he went on to design automobiles and even airplanes, lasting until 1911. I think this is a career and a story that is without equal in Texas, and it's one I'm delighted to be able to share with you tonight. Thank you.